Alright, so let's continue. And now let's actually make the request to the API endpoint in order to fetch the definition of the word that the user searched for. So for that, we need to make the request as soon as user lands on this screen, on this component that we have, the definition one. And for that, within the definition component, we first need to import the use effect hook from React. So this hook over here, it takes in a function as the first argument, and this function is called on every render of the definition component or whatever component that we place it inside of. So we can limit the number of times this function is called by passing in the second argument, which is an array, and it is also referred as dependency array. As this array, we can use it to list out all the different values that we want it to observe, and if any of those values change, it's going to recall this function that we have over here. So as we just want to make the request only one time, that too when the component first mounts, or to say when it is first rendered, we can pass in an empty dependency array as the second argument. So this thing right over here, it's now similar to the component did mount lifecycle hook that we have in the class based components. So right over here, we need to make the request. Let's do that. And we cannot make this function to be an asynchronous one. And if we want to use the async await, the common approach is to kind of create a function inside of it. So let's name it as fetch definition is going to be a function, an asynchronous one as such. Make sure to add the async keyword to this function so that we can use the await. So now let's make the request, and let me just check if we installed the Axios, this library. So we are going to use it in order to make the request. So right at the top, we first need to import Axios from the Axios package. This is a function which allows us to, well, I don't think it's a function, it's more of like an instance, and there are different static methods on it, different static functions. So using the Axios, we are going to make the request, the get request to this specific endpoint that we have over here. So let's use the backticks, because the last segment of the path is going to be the dynamic value, which is actually the word that the user searched for. So we are going to use it using the template literal in such a way in order to place it within the URL, and this thing is going to return back the response. So as it's going to be an asynchronous request, we can await it as such. And before we further proceed using the data, let's actually log it to the console, the response. Well, actually we can just get the data as such. So if we do that, and well, we also need to call this function right over here within the use effect. So now if we take a look at the console, this function will be called just once, and as we are calling this function, the fetch definition, which is defined over here, is going to make the request, and after it finishes, it's going to log the data out of the response right over here. So if we take a look, there we have the response. Well, actually the data, which is an array containing all the different definitions of different words, as you can see. So that's perfect. So now we just need to use this data in order to display the information right over here. And before we can do that, there are few things that we need to do. So we need to have a state within the component so that we can update that state whenever the response is returned. So right over here, let's create a new state. And for that, let's first import the useState hook. And let's actually, as it's going to be an array which is returned, we can keep it as an empty array by default. And let's name the state to be of definitions and the function to be of definitions as such. And now using this function, we can update the state. However, we also want to take care of the case where the user is searching for a word which is not valid. So for instance, if we type something like this, it's going to return back this message. Okay, so we need to take care of this thing. Okay, let me actually see how are we handling this over here. Okay, so we need to do that. So I think we can actually handle this case by checking the type of the returned value. Like if it's an array, then we can, like we do know that there is some definitions being returned. Otherwise, like if it's an object, well, instead what we can do is, let me actually check it out. So if I call the length, it's going to throw this thing. Anyway, we will be handling this case. For the timing, let's just assume that the user enters the right thing, although we are going to take care of it in a while. So right over here, let's update the state using the set definitions, and one second, and let's pass in the response data as such. So now if we log the definitions, the state right over here, we are going to see the same thing being within the state. So that's perfect. First we have the empty array, and then we have the one with 3 different elements. So perfect. So now let's map over this array in order to create the data as such. Let's do that. Let me actually open it up right over here. So over here within the object, now keep it in mind that we want to create these boxes, the boxes that we have over here, like this thing over here, for the definitions which we have over here. Like within the object we have the meanings, so we need to create the boxes for these objects that we have. So let's do that. Where is it? All right, so over here we have the definitions, the state, this thing, and we need to map over this thing, and we can refer the item as def, like a short form for definition, and we need to return back fragments. So as there will be multiple elements, well, actually the thing is we need to return back fragments as this thing, a particular section for a definition, this thing, it may include a divider over here, this thin line, as you can see. So that's the reason why we need to have a fragment, like we need to wrap it up inside of fragments, as there cannot be multiple elements on the same level if you're mapping over something. So at the same time, as we are mapping over an array and we are creating the components or the elements dynamically, we also need to provide a key. So for that, I think we can use the index, which is the second element. We can do that as we are not mutating the state in any way after it has been updated. So it's possible to use the index for this case. And if we want to use the key on the fragment, we need to import the fragment as such. Like otherwise we can just use the short form, which is something like this, which we are actually using over here to wrap up the entire screen. So we cannot do this thing if we need to provide a key, and we need to do it in such a way. So to this thing we need to provide the key, and we can use the index as such. So within this thing we need to add the divider. We will work on the logic part in a second. Let's first place in the divider, and below this thing we need to place in the box, well, sorry, not the box component. We need to further map over the meanings array that we have, which is inside the def object. So if I know that it may look a bit confusing, so let me just break it down even further. This definition, this thing, it's the entire array, this entire thing, the entire array containing the different objects. and this def right over here, it's actually the individual objects. And now we are creating the we are going to further map over the meanings array that we have within the objects, which means within the def. So right over here, let's again map over the def dot meanings, and within this we have these objects. So we further need to map, as you can see, we do need to map over multiple times, which is obviously not very performant. However, as this application is pretty small, we can opt to go with this way. However, if we were assuming that there were many different ways, if the returned value, it contained a lot of different objects, the other way could be that once we receive the return data, we could transform it in a simpler structure, just so that we could avoid mapping over multiple times. But again, as it's a pretty simple application, we can opt to go with this way of having multiple maps. But again, this is not the ideal way to go with if you're expecting a lot of different elements or a lot of different nested elements. Anyway, now within the definition object, we have the meanings, and within this thing, we have the definitions. So let's map over this thing, and we can name it as meaning as such. And now we need to create the objects. These objects that we have over here. These objects. So for that, let's return back a box component, and on the box component, we need to provide a bunch of different stylings. So I will not waste your time by adding them one by one. So let me just place it over here. So you can just pause the video and enter the same thing. We are adding some box shadow. You can pause the video and copy the same thing. Background color of white, padding of 16 on all the sides, border radius of 16, margin to the top of 3. So if we do that, and let's actually display the text. So we first need to display the part of speech, which we have over here. So we are mapping over the meanings. This thing, we have the meaning, which would be this object, and we need to display the part of speech as such. And let's wrap it up inside of typography, and let's change the variant to be of subtitle 1, and let's actually take a look at what we have by far, because we kind of added a lot of different things. So if we take a look, well, that's looking perfect. That's great. We have the objects where we are displaying the boxes for each of the nested meaning that we have over here, these meaning. So we are displaying these two objects that we have in the first object, and in the second one, I believe there is just one, as you can see, this thing, and within the third one there should be one as well. So that's perfect. So now we just need to display the definitions as well. Let's do that. So within the meanings, this thing, we have the definitions array, and we need to map it over and get the definition property. And I know that again it might be a bit confusing, so take your time and just look it up closely. So over here we need to have another map. So how many maps do we have? We have this thing. Okay, so currently we have kind of 2 maps, and this is going to be the third one. Again, it's not very performing, but we can go with it as we're not expecting a lot of different elements. So over here we have the meaning, which right now is going to be this specific object. So within the meaning object, individual meaning object, we have the definitions. Let's get that thing off the list. Meaning dot definitions plural map, definition, and we need to return back typography, and this thing within the typography there has to be the okay, so we are referring this thing as definition. Within this we have the definition property, so it's going to be definition.definition. So at the same time, let's use the same thing as a key, and we actually need to provide the keys, otherwise it's going to scream in the console that we are missing something out. So for the second level, the meaning, which is this thing, I guess. Okay, so for this thing, I believe we can use part of speech. Let's actually do that over here. Let's use key meaning dot what is it, part. Actually, let me just copy the same thing. Okay, alright, so we are mapping over the definitions array. We are getting the definition, we are returning back a typography, which is this thing, and now if we save it, we should be seeing the definitions as well. So there we have it. That's fine. However, we need to fix a few things. 1 second. Okay, alright, so the other thing that we need to do is, well, yeah, we need to display the index number. So for that, right over here where we're displaying the individual definition, we can check one thing, that if the definitions, this thing, well, actually let's if this thing, if it contains more than one element, then it makes sense to add in the index, or to say the counter. I think index makes more sense. So right over here we can check that thing. If the definitions array that we are currently mapping over, if the length of it is more than 1, then we can display the index. So let's actually get the index right over here. So if this is the case, then using the backticks in such a way, let's use the template literal index plus 1, as it is 0 based, like it starts from 0, and let's also add in the dot as such. So if we do that and if we take a look, we should be seeing the counter. So that's looking much better. So I think that's it. Let's actually work on the divider. We also need to display the divider as such, and for that let's actually do one thing. Okay, so for the divider within the fragment, well, actually we are placing the divider, however it's not visible. Okay, there it is, it's there, but it's kind of merging in with the upper box that we have. So for that, right over here, let's pass in the SX prop on the divider component. Let's add margin in the y-axis, top and bottom of 3, which would be 24 pixels on the top and bottom, and that's looking much better. However, it doesn't make any sense to show the divider for the very first element. So for that, right over here, we can also pass in the display CSS property, and we can check one thing, that if the definitions, sorry, not the definition, if the index is equals to 0, which means that it is the very first element, the very first object. If this is the case, then we need to set the display of none. Otherwise, we can set it to be of block. So if we do that, it's going to skip for the very first one. And that's looking much better. So let's also work on the styling in order to make it look as such. So for that, as we are using the variant of subtitle 1 for the part of speech, let's get to the theme. Right over here, we can actually copy the same thing, and let's use the same font weight on the subtitle one. Let's see, that's looking perfect. Let's change the color to be of, let's go with the gray text, which is an available option. And let's also set the text transform using the SX prop to be of capitalize as such. So if we do that and if we take a look, well, that's looking beautiful. Now for the individual definition that we have, let's do one thing. On this typography, let's pass in the color. Let's again set it to be of gray text, and let's set the variant to be of body 2, which is slightly smaller than the usual size. And if we take a look, well, that's looking perfect. And I think that is it. Maybe we can add some margin on the typography, which is for the individual definition. So over here, let's pass in SX margin to the Y of about 1. And that is looking much better. So as you can see that, well, actually 1 minute, something didn't work right, because we have the counter for this thing, even though there is just a single definition. So it seems like it isn't working. Well, obviously it isn't working because it has to be meaning dot definitions. We need to check the definitions array which is inside the meaning, and now it has been fixed. So that is perfect. Alright, so this completes the UI part of it, and now we need to work on a few other things, such as we need to work on the playing the audio, the pronunciation, if it exists, because it's not always going to be the case. And at the same time, we also need to show the loader, like while we are fetching the data from the endpoint. Plus we also need to take care of like if there is no definition for the word that the user searched for. So let's do all of that in the next video.